What is good, Raider Nation? It's your boy Raider Alex back with yet another video for you guys. Anybody that's new to the channel, you guys love Raider related content just like this, make sure to like, comment, subscribe to the channel. That being said, let's jump right into the topic of this video. The topic of Antonio Pierce and the future of him at the helm of the Las Vegas Raiders organization has been a huge topic of discussion all season long. I mean, some people want Antonio Pierce gone just because they think he's unqualified. They're frustrated with his overall game management or lack thereof. And of course, a 2-10 season record hasn't helped his case at all. But some people believe that Antonio Pierce deserves more time and another opportunity as the Raiders head coach. And they believe we need some continuity at the head coach position. And, there's been rumors about the Raiders possibly moving on from AP, possibly hiring, Mike Vrabel, Ben Johnson, or even Deion Sanders as a future replacement of Antonio Pierce. Now, it's a very interesting question. And in my opinion, there's no clear answer for this because there are legit arguments and concerns on both sides of the coin when it comes to this topic. But one thing to take into consideration, though, is that the Raiders roster, the Raiders team, the football players, they have not quit on Antonio Pierce. Antonio Pierce has not lost the locker room, and it's something that I was definitely concerned about early on in the season, especially after, the whole Devontae Adams situation with Antonio Pierce calling out his team about making business decisions. But overall, I thought Antonio Pierce, the way I looked at it is, if he was ever a guy that lost the Raiders locker room, if the players and the team eventually quit on him, then at that point he was absolutely cooked as a head coach. And at that point you would have to move on from him, especially, considering the fact that Antonio Pierce is more of a player's coach. He's more a leader of men. He's the type of guy that's going to rally the troops. And he's not really a guy who specializes in any specific area when it comes to the X's and O's of football. So that being said, I thought it was super important that Antonio Pierce found a way to not lose the locker room and ultimately to have this team playing hard, competitive football. Early on in the season, it definitely looked scary, but I will say we have been improving as a football team. We're getting more competitive, and ultimately the Raiders had their best performance last week on the road at Arrowhead Stadium, and ultimately you could make the argument that the Raiders should have won that game. But they were a couple plays away from beating the 11-1 Kansas City Chiefs. But with the Raiders starting to play better, our team color commentator Lincoln Kennedy was asked about this topic on Raider Nation radio. And he was essentially asked if he has learned anything about this football team in the last few weeks. And to quote Lincoln Kennedy, he says, "To me, it tells me that this coaching staff needs another chance. When you talk about the situation the Raiders are in, you came into the season knowing you weren't going to have a quarterback, knowing you were going to try to play with some things and try to see if some things would work your way. They don't have all the pieces. I'll be the first one to admit that, but they do have some good pieces, enough to make themselves relevant, and we saw the fight that they played with in that Kansas City game. They did make themselves relevant, so many issues we're talking about, it is what it is, but the thing is, they've shown a great deal of fight, and I think this coaching staff deserves another chance." So definitely very interesting comments and the overall take from Lincoln Kennedy. Overall, I don't think he's lying. I think the Raiders don't have all the pieces to seriously compete as it stands, but I'm also not going to completely let Antonio Pierce off the hook, as you can definitely make the argument that he did a poor job handling the quarterback room this season. He ended up choosing Gardner Minshew as a starter over Aiden O'Connell, and so far that's not looking like a great move. Let's call it what it is. Gardner Minshew looked very bad out there as a starter for a vast majority of the season. He had a couple games where he did good, but for the most part, he's been a turnover machine. And you can definitely make the argument that he should have started Aiden O'Connell. And ultimately, if you were going to go into the season not super confident, and now I definitely understand, with it being a new season, you're always going to want to compete. You think your football team's going to be good, but I think looking at this roster, you had to have had a sense that there was a good possibility that the season could go out this way. And I think ultimately if we're going to go into like some type of rebuild year where we're just going to be one of the worst teams in football, you should have started the younger quarterback. You should have started the quarterback who has more upside, and you should have just ultimately started the quarterback and Aiden O'Connell, just ultimately see what you truly have in him. That way you can make the best decision possible moving forward. Instead, we went with the veteran quarterback who has a very low ceiling and a player that we ultimately know what he is. So I definitely don't love how he handled that quarterback room. And one thing I have seen a lot is a lot of fans have speculated that the decision for him to bench Aiden O'Connell to start the season, that was not an Antonio Pierce decision, and it wasn't his decision to be made. And obviously, I mean, we don't know if that's true. We're not in the building, but I'm just going to go under the assumption. Let's just say that is true. In my opinion, if that is the case, that is a major red flag for me, in my opinion. I mean, just think about it. How many head coaches in the National Football League can you name and say they don't have final say so on who is going to be their starting quarterback? I mean, that's literally your job as a head coach. Your job is to figure out which players should be on the football field, make those decisions, and ultimately make those decisions to try to get your team to win. And if that is true, I mean, what does that ultimately say about the trust level that Mark Davis and that Tom Telesco have in Antonio Pierce? We also hired a bunch of former coaches to this coaching staff to try to help Antonio Pierce. So if that's the case, we got all these different former coaches on the staff. You're not letting him make the decision on who's going to be your starting quarterback. At that point, do you really believe in Antonio Pierce? And if you don't, you might as well just move on from him. There's got to be a level of trust there between Mark Davis and Antonio Pierce. You can't have your coach under such a tight leash like that. We all obviously knew when we hired Antonio Pierce that he was not a for sure thing, that it was going to be a gamble. But ultimately, you got to let him do his job the way he sees fit. Because ultimately, under this assumption, if this is true, I mean, let's call a spade a spade. If that is the case, essentially, Antonio Pierce is a puppet coach for the Raiders. Now, I will say, though, to me, Antonio Pierce does not really strike me as a coach that's just gonna bend to the knee like that. So I don't necessarily believe in this narrative. I find it a little bit hard to believe that he did not have final say-so over such an important decision like this when it comes to choosing your starting quarterback. Now, ultimately, Antonio Pierce wanted Jaden Daniels as his quarterback, and he wanted offensive coordinator Cliff Kingsbury. And as we all know by now, Jaden Daniels and Cliff Kingsbury in Washington has worked out tremendously. But unfortunately for Antonio Pierce and for us as a fan base, that was just unattainable for us this offseason. Personally, as it stands, I would definitely be okay with giving Antonio Pierce one more season to get things right. Now, ultimately, he's going to be on the hot seat next year. He has to make major improvements, and he definitely needs to have pressure on him if we're going to bring him back next season. So I would definitely be okay with bringing him back. Now, the only caveat I want to mention would be if there was a clear upgrade available at the head coaching position. If a high-end coach somehow, some way ended up being available, and like I said, if he's a guy who's a clear upgrade, then I wouldn't mind that. I mean, one crazy scenario that may happen would be, what if the San Francisco 49ers and Kyle Shanahan ended up parting ways? There definitely seems to be some tension there. The 49ers season has gone terrible. Their season is essentially over, and you can make a legit case that their Super Bowl window is done for. So in a crazy scenario like that, if he ended up being available, then in that situation, I mean, then all bets are off. I would definitely go all in for a coach of Kyle Shanahan's resume. But obviously, that's a crazy hypothetical situation. But ultimately, I would give Antonio Pierce another shot, but he has to get the quarterback position right this offseason and the offensive coordinator position as well. Quite literally, his job would depend on it. Ultimately, let me know what you guys think about Lincoln Kennedy's take. Do you think Antonio Pierce deserves another year, another shot next season? Let me know in that comment section down below. But with that being said, Raider Nation, that's all for you guys in today's video. Anybody that's new to the channel and you guys love Raider related content just like this, make sure to like, comment, subscribe to the channel. That being said, I will see you guys in the next one.